It therefore gives me great personal pleasure to be able to welcome to the Euromoney stage His Excellency Mr. Riad Salamé, Governor of the Banque de Liban. Your Excellency. So the format for the first couple of sessions is that I have the great privilege of being able to ask His Excellency some, and I must say, unscripted questions. He doesn't know what I'm going to ask him. And the same will go for my next interviewee, Sadazari from Banque. So, despite the fact that this is primarily an event that covers innovation in financial services, I'm going to start with a much bigger picture. There are so many things going on in the world, and of course in the region and in Lebanon, that I think we need to start there. So, Governor, let's look at the global economy, which is a confusing picture, I think, to the extent that the US is doing very well, it's growing very fast, but rate rises have started and seem to be on the horizon. What's your take on how the global economy is moving and what that means for key factors for Lebanon, like rates and capital flows?
On the economic level, it is clear that the growth, according to various estimates, worldwide would be over 3%. The emerging markets are still retaining a contribution that is more important than the developed economies. But on the other side, on the financial markets, we have seen changes since the beginning of this year. It has become a reality that in the United States, the interest rates are going to go higher, as announced by the Federal Reserve Board. They are still expecting 3 increases, at least between now and mid 2019. And on the other hand, the deficits are going to increase in the US budget, and therefore the needs for borrowing are increasing, and you have inflationary pressures. That's why the 10-year bond, by anticipation, has reached 3%, and the markets are nervous because there are possibility to see over 3% on the 10-year bond, although some investment houses have recommended to buy the 10-year bond now.
Well, investment houses recommend all sorts of things.
So that has shaken the emerging markets, and we have seen currencies drop in these markets. We have seen also the interest rates go higher, and some countries requested the assistance of the IMF. As far as we are concerned in Lebanon, interest rates had risen during the November crisis, when we had the resignation of Prime Minister Hariri. We didn't feel or see that there was a need for further increase in the interest rates, and therefore the interest rates have been stable since, and markets are in equilibrium. The Lebanese pound currency is stable. We don't see pressure on it. So we avoided what we have seen in other emerging markets. The yields on our Eurobonds went up in sympathy with what is happening in the emerging markets, where we have seen several sell-off. But the movement on our bonds is taking place on very small, on thin trading, which means that positive news can create demand again and readjust the prices of the Eurobonds.
if we stay with the US to start with, well, the relationship perhaps between the US and the emerging markets has the general change in sentiment towards EM assets since January. Is that, in your mind, a function purely of what is happening in the US, or does it have any indication that there's something wrong in emerging markets?
Well, I think that the financial markets are moving now depending on the movement of capital. So when the crisis of 2008 happened, the movement of capital went from developed economies to emerging markets. Now we're starting to see a reversal, and it has been accelerated by the tax waivers done by the US administration to repatriate funds into the United States. That's why you could see that the Libor spread against the Fed spread has widened. So the initiative and the mover of the markets today are the United States, and the readjustment that we are seeing in the curves of interest rates in the US.
And how political is that, in the sense of, is it driven by the policies, if you can call them that, of the Trump administration, this change towards a more, how does he say, America first, being more confrontational on trade, disrupting, as he would put it, the relationship with allies, basically repositioning America's role in the world. Is that political? Is the political situation driving it, or is it really just a question of what the US economy is doing, moving up rates, the taxes, the capital flows? Where does the macro-political balance lie?
Well, I believe that first, this was the program of President Trump, so we're not surprised. The trade war that has started it was confined to currency movements and intervention, has widened now to a tariff war, which is not going to be good for any economy, I believe. And on the other hand, you could see that the growth in China is decelerating, and in Europe you have issues because of the Brexit, of the populism, Italian elections, the immigrants. So I think the US has today politically an advantage on its allies, at least.
Certainly. So what I'm trying to get to is that this phase that we're in your opinion, is more likely to continue than flow back to what it was like before?
Yes, I believe so. At least the markets are indicating that. And it is today a fact that if you look at the emerging markets, you see the interest rates at levels we didn't see before during the past at least 10 years. And you could see also that the flows they have are less, so it is a trend that will take time to reverse.
But is this, I mean, some people would put forward the argument that this is really a normalization. This is a return to what markets should be like based on what happened before the global financial crisis. That what we're seeing now is normalization, not something, it's only abnormal because of what has happened over the past 8 years, 10 years since the global financial crisis. Is this just a rebalancing back to what the global economy should look like, or is it something that is different?
No, it's a rebalancing, but at a higher cost for the emerging markets. So if you look today at the developments on the interest rates in the emerging markets, you could see that it has served the growth in the economies. And if you consider the outsourcing of production and the exports of the emerging market countries that has flourished during this 10 years, the reversal here is happening at a higher cost because it is being implemented with new tariffs on trade, on imports, and also a quick withdrawal of funds that is driving higher interest rates and a situation in a few countries that needed to have the IMF intervene.
Argentina, particularly.
Exactly.
In that case, but you can always guarantee Argentina will be dramatic in one form or another. It's a wonderful country, but they don't half make the news. So, what does this mean for Lebanon specifically? You touched on that in the opening response, but this is an exogenous factor. I mean, these pressures are being put on Lebanon not as a result of anything that's happening in Lebanon. You have your own issues, and we'll come to those in a minute. But you're an emerging market. You suffer when all emerging markets suffer. You benefit when all emerging markets benefit. If the tide has changed, has turned a little bit against EM as an asset class, what does that mean for Lebanon, or indeed for the region in particular?
First, for Lebanon has relied on funds that are not merely institutional, and therefore the volatility is lower. Also, the involvement of the international investors in our paper is confined to the Eurobond and in a manageable size. We have regulations that has barred the international investors to go onto the Lebanese denominated paper, Lebanese pound denominated papers. Of course, it is affected, we are affected by the psychology of the markets and by the liquidity in the region, given the wars that are happening, and oil prices, although they went up, but not enough to create excess liquidity. But Lebanon remains essentially on its diaspora, and as long as confidence prevails, the funding of the country is in order.
You mentioned the Gulf. Let's talk a little bit about that one. You mentioned oil prices, and therefore that has a huge impact on the Gulf. As you say, their economies are not in surplus in any meaningful way, any of them, possibly Kuwait and maybe Abu Dhabi, but it's marginal, and it looks as if the Saudis and Russia have combined to create a new version of OPEC, which will limit the oil price to between 70 and 80. So it's unlikely that there's going to be huge amounts of surplus capital in those economies. And also, they have publicly said that if they are generating surpluses, they're going to invest more of that domestically. Combined with that, of course, a proportion of the Lebanese diaspora work in the Gulf, and the Gulf economies are all saying that they want to localize their workforces. So that's really two questions. The first of all is, do you believe that the localization policies in the Gulf will have a significant impact upon the remittances from the Lebanese diaspora? And secondly, what is your view on the health of their economies and their relationship with Lebanon overall?
Well, on the remittances, as we are tracking things, they're still consistent. So, despite all the changes in oil prices, we have seen figures that maybe were not as high as 4 or 5 years ago, but they are still consistent with what we expect. The World Bank is talking about the remittances between $7 and $8 billion for this year. On the other hand, I think that today you have a situation where real estate in all the region, not only because they talk about real estate stagnation in Lebanon, but it is the case also in the Arab Gulf countries, in other countries. It's linked to the liquidity, of course. And I think that the Lebanese who are in this sector are suffering in Lebanon and in the Gulf. But we are not at a point where there is really a crisis, because the central bank, for instance, in Lebanon, has a circular saying that promoters can cover their debt with real estate, and they are not classified if they do so. So far, we didn't receive requests to use this circular. Also, maybe 10 years ago, we had the same circular, and there were requests for more than $1.5 billion of loans were covered at that time with this circular. Our estimate for this year is that the non-performing loans will go up, but not dramatically. It will go up maybe from 3.25% of the portfolio to around 4%, which we can absorb. So I believe that we have readjusted gradually to a new situation, and we have started to readjust with the beginning of the Syrian war 5 or 6 years ago.
It's good to hear your prognosis that things are challenging, but not in a crisis, both in the real estate sector. But Lebanon's economy is, if not in crisis, is certainly not moving as quickly as it should do. It may be a little stagnant. The government's deficit is high. The recent CEDAW conference put forward various, recommendations, conditions. Where do you sit on that? Is there there are significant structural issues in the Lebanese economy. We all know that. We've talked about them every time we've been here. We've written about them in Euromoney magazine. They're no surprise to anyone. The external environment has become a little more challenging. We're not at a crisis point, and I think no one says that. What is the pathway for this country to turn that corner? Is it purely political, or are there substantial economic or financial aspects to it as well?
Well, first of all, we have to remember that Lebanon is carrying the cost of 1.5 million Syrian refugees. And also, although there is a fatigue and people don't want to hear about it or talk about it anymore, but this is a reality. So whatever restructuring you're going to do in Lebanon will not give the results we want as long as we have the Syrian crisis. And obviously, from the attitude of several countries, the crisis is not near an end. So we have to take this into consideration when we are going to do the reforms, because it is unfair that the Lebanese people suffer for also have an extra suffering for a problem that is not really their problem. Now, in the Sadr conference, the government has committed to decrease the deficit to GDP by 5% in 5 years. And this decrease will happen not only by taxes, but also by trying to stimulate the economy. And there are 220 projects where we have funding for them. The countries have committed between 11 and 12 billion dollars. And also there is a hope, because of these projects, to have an essential reversal in the macro picture of the country, because our country has seen the public sector grow too much, creating inefficiencies and corruption and inducing taxes. This sector has grown from 17% of GDP before the war in 75 to 35% today. And this is the major, I believe this is the major weakness. We have to put the private sector, give it a priority, and the projects in Sadr are about that. We have to create again the entrepreneurial spirit of the Lebanese.
But how much is it about reforming the public finances? I mean, it's not just about the size of the economy, it's about the way in which the public sector, the government, transmits economic value to the citizens through subsidies of, example, electricity. In the other events that we do, in the coverage we do of the region, almost all countries in this region are now changing the way their systems work, away from subsidizing products, to subsidizing to subsidizing people. Is that going to happen in Lebanon? Is that change in approach something that's realistic?
It is planned to happen because, let's say first, if we take the electricity sector, the intention is to provide electricity for 22 or 24 hours a day from the Électricité du Liban, and to stop the subsidies on electricity. That is a project that the government is working on, and so on, because there is no funds anymore for subsidies.
Well, subsidies of the electricity, but I mean there must be there's social welfare and all of that. Those are different.
No, that's different.
Yeah. But I mean, you don't take away someone who can't afford to pay for electricity has it, but they can't use it for free. That's the principle. We have a few minutes left, so let's if we may move on to looking at financial innovation and all of those things, which after all is the core theme of today's event. We've been working with you and others since the inception, in fact, before the inception of Circular 331. That's now 3.5 years?
4 years.
4 years, yeah. I mean, time flies. I bet you don't feel you've been there for 25 years, Your Excellency. You must have been very young when you started. Anyway, that's the different question.
A child.
But a very well qualified child. Well, you started 1 year before I started at Euromoney, which is, I suppose, good because we're both still here in one way or another. FinTech, right now, financial technology, innovation has been a theme that you have been promoting for the last years. Start with 331. Where are we in that cycle? I mean, is that now showing some of the results that you wanted it to show in terms of the development of local technology companies? Not necessarily financial services, could be anything. Are you pleased with the way that has worked?
We were surprised positively because in 4 years, Lebanon has now a sector that do represent around 1% of 1.5% of its GDP, and we have been cited as the best in the region in the countries that have that are starting this process. 331 is a success because $400 million have been committed, around 260 have been deployed, and there is more potential because the equity of banks are increasing and it's 2% of equity they can use. So the prospects are good. Today, what we have achieved is that we have accelerators in the country, which is essential for the industry. There are funds with specialized people who can deploy the money professionally. And you have start-up companies as a standalone that are performing. And BDL is committed to follow up on this sector. We believe Lebanon will change with the development of the digital economy. Its economy will change. There will be more employment, and young talent will stay or will come back to the country.
So 331 broadly a success. We'll be talking, I'm sure, a lot more about it later today. In general, though, in financial services particularly, fintech, which is a word I confess I don't really know what that means, but innovation in financial services, blockchain, payments, all of that, where does Lebanon sit with that? I believe, as you heard in my speech, that it's more about the plumbing of the system. It's more about improvements, evolution, rather than a fundamental change. Do you see the financial sector being broadly in the throes of an evolutionary change, or do you think something fundamentally different is happening with fintech, that models are being re-engineered as well as processes?
I think it's all an issue of serving the consumer at a better price and an efficient service. So in Lebanon, fintech has been progressing. Banks are using applications to improve their services. There are even applications to implement IFRS 9. And that is a lot. I mean, it's cost efficient. It's good for the consumer. The development in the payment systems are good also because we are using more and more technology, and we can develop system to counter the cyber crimes, which are one of the major systemic risks today. So it is there. Now we have certain limitations because we cannot go as free as other countries for compliance reasons, and but we are looking at that to see what are the solutions. Lebanon, as you know, was able to preserve its reputation from a compliance approach. So we don't want to take any risk in that.
Is that, I mean, compliance being AML?
Exactly. So the implementation has helped Lebanon remain integrated in the financial market. So there are areas where Lebanon has still to make some progress.
But do you see things like the blockchain being disruptive to the system, or do you see them just as a gradual implementation of new ways of doing the same old thing? Or are there going to be new models that come out of this, things that people can do, customers can do in 5 years that they can't do now, like portability of bank accounts, like transparency on fees, all of this? Where is the customer going to see a difference?
I think you have to differentiate between the blockchain technology and the cryptocurrency.
Absolutely, yeah.
Now, the blockchain is, a system that is being used more and more because of what you said. I mean, you have a perfect archiving system, and on which you can build for developments. On the cryptocurrency in Lebanon, we don't accept it as a way of payment.
Good.
Nevertheless, the central bank is working now, and we have several teams working on that to develop a digital currency that the central bank will be responsible for, and the banks can use in their operations.
What would be the benefits? Why would a bank use that?
I think that for local small payments, it is cheaper for consumer and more profitable for banks. It will not be a digital currency that will go international. It can be in any currency, but in Lebanon.
And is that partially at least to move the economy towards a more cashless system? I mean, are you trying to take cash out and replace it with
No,
digital?
it's just to facilitate, increase the payment system tools, which will help the economy. The cash will remain. We are in the Middle East, and we like to see tender.
Yes, I can't imagine the Middle East without a wad of notes in my pocket. But do you not feel that some of these? Well, okay, no, unequivocally, it is a true thing to say that some of these innovations, the process innovations as well as the product innovations, have been net negative for the system. I'm thinking of what they call malgorithms in the States, where whole customer groups were disenfranchised from receiving credit or insurance on the basis of algorithmic programs, unintentionally, or of, as we know, credit derivatives, all of these sort of things. Now, these were innovations. When they came in, this is the great thing. The implications, the systemic impact of these innovations was not fully understood. And with credit derivatives and mortgage-backed securities and all of that, we saw the destruction they could wreak. That's an extreme example. But any innovation, any disruption does not come without some form of cost. How do you manage that risk as a relatively speaking, quite a small central bank compared to, say, one in Europe or elsewhere?
The cost is on employment. You will need less people in the sector, and therefore you have to find other means to create jobs elsewhere.
But is that your responsibility?
No.
No. Good. At least that's something you're not responsible for. You seem to be responsible for rather a lot. So, we've run out of time, unfortunately. So, my final question: you have another 5 years to run on this term of your governorship. We hope, if you decide you want to continue, we hope, of course, that you're renewed. But looking out over those 5 years, looking out in 5 years, where do you see Lebanon being 5 years from now? I mean, it's a complex situation, but do you see us being in a better place in 5 years, and what would that look like?
Well, I believe the action of the government is going to determine where we will be, because as I mentioned, they have the challenge of reforms, the challenge of implementing quickly projects related to infrastructure, and you have the gas and oil exploration. At least this should take place, so we know exactly where we stand. If there is not, how much. There are these challenges that we have to take up locally. I hope that the Syrian war will have ended, and that would also help the Lebanese economy in a way or another, because we suffered from this war, and our trade and services also decreased because of this war and what is around it. The sanctions also in the Middle East are due to this war. So I think that this is what we are looking at, and when we go over the immediate difficulties, I think the horizons are good for Lebanon.
That's an excellent line on which to end, Your Excellency. Thank you very, very much for your time.
Thank you.
Much appreciated. Please join me.